Hi, everybody. Jeff Wise back with you. When officials realized on the morning of March 8th, 2014, that MH370 had disappeared, they feared the worst. The plane had vanished from air traffic control radar over the South China Sea. It had not arrived at its destination airport, hadn't arrived anywhere else. And historically, when that sort of thing happens, it's because the plane has crashed, usually not very far from its last transmission. And so as day broke on that morning of March 8th, they sent out search and rescue assets. They sent out planes, ships, helicopters, with the goal of locating the crash site, recovering bodies, looking for the black box. They didn't expect anything good. But what happened was quite surprising. There was no wreckage. There was no sign of the plane anywhere near where the plane had last sent its final transmission, and that was puzzling. But then something even stranger happened, something that had never occurred in the history of aviation before. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Hi, I'm Jeff Wise, and welcome to Episode 3 of Deep Dive MH370, The Second Vanishing. This is a remake of an episode that I made originally with Andy Tarnoff and published in October of 2023. It was our third episode. We were still figuring out how to make a podcast. It was the first one that we did both as a video and as an audio podcast. The quality was not as good as we later figured out how to make it, but the material that we covered, I think, is important and interesting enough that I wanted to preserve it and repost it, basically modified, remastered, and somewhat edited. If you like these podcasts and you want to encourage me to make more, please, if you could do anything, hit the subscribe button. That really helps me out if you could do that. Okay, let's get right to it. Andy Tarnoff, take it away.
We left off after day one, which was when MH370 took off from Kuala Lumpur and headed northeast, and then poof, it
disappeared from air traffic control radar screens. And so we're gonna talk about what happened next. And
maybe we'll jump around a little bit.
Sure, that sounds great.
We left off where it had disappeared off of secondary radar and primary radar at that point, but it turns out that it popped back up again.
So as the story was unfolding, as the authorities were trying to figure out what happened, there were all these rumors flying around, and there were some rumors that maybe the plane had landed in Cambodia. And it was really hard. There's kind of the fog of war. They're trying to understand what had happened. And as the days went by, there was a new rumor that began to spread. Up until that time, all the authorities knew was, and that they had conveyed to the public, was that the plane had disappeared from air traffic control radars. And then there were rumors that something else was happening that the authorities weren't being totally on the up and up about.
Do you remember how you started hearing about these rumors? Because before Malaysia came clean, there was chatter, right?
Yeah, there were things filtering out. Reporters were saying that that sources had indicated that the Malaysian military had actually picked up this plane. When the plane disappeared from air traffic control radar, the assumption was that it had crashed. That was the most likely assumption given what had happened historically in the past in similar such incidences. This was now a stunning idea. The idea that no, actually it hadn't crashed at all, it had kept flying. But the Malaysian authorities, the military in particular, were denying this at first. So they initially had set up a search area in the South China Sea under the path where the plane had last been seen. Then they started dispatching ships and aircraft to search somewhere else entirely, other part of the country, on the western side of the Malayan Peninsula, what's called the Malacca Strait and the Andaman Sea, which is the bit of ocean in between Malaysia and India.
Yeah, so eventually Malaysia came clean and said, well, actually, our military radar had tracked a plane or something. It could have been birds. They didn't say what it was. Using the radar that is the old-fashioned ping, not one with transponders, of this plane or thing that looked like a plane now heading west. And people were astounded.
Right. So this is the primary radar. This is something that doesn't require any electrical transmissions from the plane. everything it seems on the plane had been turned off. So the plane was flying kind of in stealth mode, you might say, although it's not a stealthy
Yeah.
aircraft, don't get me wrong. But the plane had sort of turned off all of the things it usually uses to broadcast its location and was flying dark, as it were, electronically dark. But it was still visible to these primary radars, which are shining electromagnetic radiation into the atmosphere, into space, and watching it to be reflected back. So it's as if these radar systems were shining a flashlight, and they saw this plane come from the direction where MH370 had last been spotted, flew back over the Malaysian Peninsula, actually flew over a Malaysian Air Force base, flew to this island off the west coast of the Malayan Peninsula called Penang, and then had turned and flown straight up this body of water that lies in between Indonesia and Thailand.
Yeah. So first of all, this shiny object is flying at like 29,000 feet or something like that, which is not that different than what it would have been flying when it disappeared. I think it was maybe at 35,000 feet, but it's definitely like an appropriate cruising altitude for a 777.
Yeah.
Probably not birds.
No, it's definitely not birds. The obvious question is, okay, how come you didn't tell us this right away? That was really the burning question. And the families, remember, the families are still left wondering, well, what happened? Where are my loved ones? And when everyone realized that the Malaysian military had not been forthcoming, had denied at one point that they had found that they had seen a plane flying, from the last known position of MH370, they were infuriated. They're like, you're not being honest with us. We want to know everything, and you're not telling it to us. Journalists, of which I was one covering at the time, were also pretty frustrated. We like to know what's going on. This was a very important case. There's 239 lives on board this plane. Please be open with us. Now, the excuse that was given at the time was, well, we didn't know that it was MH370. Now, the kind of radar we talked about last week, secondary radar, the plane is actively transmitting information. It's transmitting its altitude, and it's transmitting a code that tells you definitively that this is this plane. When it's just primary radar, all you're seeing is a blip. You don't know, it's not telling you anything. And they have a way to roughly tell how high it's flying, but it's very crude. And so if you look at just the raw data that was released to the public, it looks like this plane is changing altitudes at an almost impossible rate. And the reason for that is that it is impossible. It was just what you're seeing is noise in the data. Speed was changing in random ways too. It doesn't, if you take that data completely at face value, it doesn't make any sense.
If you're a guy looking at radar guy in the Malaysian Air Force, you could legitimately be confused. I mean, this is not the most first world Air Force. It's in the middle of the night, but nonetheless, it's still flying over their base. They didn't scramble. They didn't scramble any jets. They didn't tell anyone.
This raises all kinds of questions.
If this was the United States, I mean, they'd scramble, F-15s, F-16s all over the place.
That is the common assumption that I think bears second checking, because in fact it's expensive and labor intensive to have like jets sitting on the ground with their engines spooled up ready to go at a moment's notice. That's something that would happen in a height of extreme tension, right? So maybe the border between India and Pakistan, there might be that kind of level of tension where people are maliciously ingressing other people's airspace. In this case, it's like, look, Malaysia has never been at war with another country ever in its history.
Yeah.
And it has a small air force. And so they certainly weren't on high alert. They certainly weren't expecting anybody to attack them. We don't even know if this radar station was even being manned. They might have just left it on auto, and like your security cam, when you go to bed, your security cam is recording anybody that comes to your doorstep, and then you check it in the morning.
So that's just so significant. Yeah, what you're saying is that a country like Malaysia isn't on emergency standby at all moments because they don't have any active enemies. They don't have a huge budget. We don't know their capabilities. Maybe somebody does, and maybe that's part of the story. But this may have been a pretty typical response to a giant plane flying across, this giant area for hours. It's easy to Monday morning quarterback it, but maybe it's not that weird after all.
No, this is a dynamic that we see again and again in the story, where people have kind of a common sense understanding of how things work in the world, and that isn't necessarily true. Like, it isn't necessarily true that people are manning the radar station all night. For instance, as the plane went up the Malacca Strait, It was also within range of Indonesian radar and Thai radar. And neither of those countries said that they saw anything. Now, did they not see anything because, they just, it wasn't turned on, nobody was paying attention, maybe it was broken. We just don't know. We don't know, but I think the fact that neither Indonesia nor Thailand even saw it, I think gives us a data point. It tells us that countries don't always maintain their radar coverage. They don't always see everything that's there, even if it's a big old thing like a 777. And that, if that seems incredible to people, I would point out that in the course of 9/11, as planes were flying around, traffic controllers lost contact with one of the planes, the one that actually wound up crashing in Pennsylvania.
The fact that the Malaysia Air Force didn't scramble, didn't tell anyone, maybe didn't even know, it may not be that surprising for a country like this.
They weren't expecting any kind of attack. They might not have even had their radar station manned. And so they certainly didn't respond. They didn't launch any fighter jets to explore what was happening. Why was this unidentified plane crossing over one of their Air Force bases? But what was, I think, a little bit more surprising is the fact that they lied about it. They didn't exactly cover it up, but they launched this other search area while they were still conducting a search in the first area. Well, they had seen the plane cross over their Air Force base and fly up the Malacca Strait. Why were they still searching in the South China Sea?
It sucks because they wasted a lot of valuable time. They wasted a lot of people's energy. They wasted U.S. ships that were searching, Australian ships, Chinese ships. Countries started to give up, right?
Yeah. And so maybe the excuse is, well, we weren't 100% sure that it was MH370 because it didn't have an identifier tag on it. Well, okay, but who else could it possibly have been? What's important to know is that the plane, as seen on radar, the plane flew up the Malacca Straits. It sort of reached the end of radar coverage area because you can only see so far. You're sending radiation out into space, and then if the plane is too far away, the reflected signal is too weak to be detected by your antenna, so you just can't see it anymore. And I don't think it's that surprising that radars have a limited range, and it's on the order of like 100 or 200 miles. And so the plane flew to the edge of that coverage, and then it disappeared. It was out of radar coverage range. No one else had radar coverage in that area, and the plane has now vanished for a second time. It first vanished from secondary radar, as we discussed last week, and then now it has 40 minutes later disappeared again, this time from primary radar. And so this is a case, this is right then at that point already the craziest interaction that's ever happened.
So I got to ask you this. I mean, as a fellow journalist, at this point, you've already been on CNN. What were you saying to these reporters when you kept finding this stuff out one after another?
I mean, my suspicions, I'm already like, this is not normal. Something is up. My sort of spidey senses were tingling. I had spent a lot of time in Air France 447, where a plane had disappeared after leaving the air traffic control area. The fact that this happened so soon after, and then it turned this crazy maneuver. So what I saw is whoever took this plane knew how to fly a plane, right? They knew that, and not everybody knows how to fly a plane. It's just, you're already like reducing your list of culprits a lot by just that fact. They knew how air traffic control works. And when they turned back, as seen on this radar, they didn't descend. They weren't sort of spiraling downward. They weren't heading for the nearest airport. They were actually probably climbing, although we're not 100% sure, but they were definitely accelerating. They were flying really fast, and they were going like a bat out of hell. They were also flying along the Malay-Thai border, which might be significant. If you're trying to avoid anyone noticing you, you might kind of stick to the border so that no one would think that you were in their airspace. So right away, right out of the gate, I'm like, I am suspicious. I think this plane was stolen. Stolen by who? Most likely the pilot, but not necessarily. And so I thought that this was a theft, most likely by the captain. I think that's what's happening here. Now, I later changed my view, but at the time, that was what I was already suspicious that something was up.
As I was reading old news accounts from March 14th, you had Interpol saying, we don't think this was terrorism. We have the CIA saying, maybe it was terrorism, but we don't have any reason to believe it. We have a story about some misconduct with the co-pilot who brought some women into the cockpit. There was thoughts that if they wanted to disappear off of radar, they could have flown really low and really fast, but that would have burned a bunch of fuel, which wouldn't jive with what we found on the radar later. It must have been so confusing for media to try to wrap its head around this, but then also for the authorities to wrap their heads around this, because
and
nothing
the public,
like this had ever happened.
Think about the whole, I called it the peanut gallery, but everyone had their 2 cents, social media, Reddit, and I thought it had to be some kind of hijacking. But the kind of story that was most appealing to the public were stories like the hero pilot, like maybe there was a fire on board and the pilot had turned back because he was trying to save everybody.
Okay, we're going to go way over our time, but we do have to discuss a couple things, like a couple of the theories that people had and why they may or may not have been possible. One that always sticks out to me is that something happened on the plane, hypoxia, an emergency, and autopilot took over and turned it left. But it's very important for people to realize that autopilot can't make I don't know what that angle is, but something that's steep. Yeah. That's not how.
Well, no, it was the turn. They didn't figure this out until much later, but they later determined that the turn that was made in that initial turn back after the plane went dark was so steep that it couldn't have been carried out by autopilot. It could only have been carried out like by manual input into the plane.
So that's huge. Someone was alive in the cockpit. If that plane, which it did, which we all agree, or at least for the purpose of this podcast, we agree that plane turned left. It didn't gradually turn left.
It turned really hard and aggressively. Yeah. So to my mind, this means it was an aggressive act and it was a sophisticated act, meaning that whoever did it at least knew how to fly a commercial plane. So there were all kinds of theories. And at this point, we had so little information. It was like let 1,000 flowers bloom because it was really hard to rule anything out. One of the more interesting ideas is that the plane had snuck under a regularly scheduled flight and was flying like in the sort of shadow of another plane that was flying to India or something. And this got a lot of traction, actually. In those days, like almost any theory would get picked up by the newspapers and stuff. So it was a kind of chaotic time. There was lots of information that turned out later not to be true, like the rumor that the plane had landed in Cambodia. And so we just were completely flabbergasted. We knew that the authorities weren't being completely honest with us, and we didn't really know what was true and what wasn't. But we did know from the minute that it became clear that the Malaysians had detected this thing on their radar, this was already a very, very unusual case.
And they shared their data eventually. So it's not just
I mean, they shared the initial part of it, but the first 20 minutes they've never shared the final 20 minutes. We know that there was one final radar ping at 1822 universal time, final ping, but we don't know anything about it. Like if it was a series of pings, it was a single ping. There's been kind of contradictory noises made about it. So even to this day, there's things that we could usefully know that could really, I think, help us narrow down the possibilities that for whatever reason the Malaysians still aren't fully being frank about. We were talking about this offline earlier, and there's this old William Faulkner quote: "The past isn't dead; it isn't even past." This is very much alive. M8-370 is not a historical artifact; it's a living mystery, and it still engages people, not always in the most helpful ways.
Okay, so that brings up the most important thing. A very important plane has crashed in Russia, and it killed the head of the Wagner Group. Exactly 2 months after he tried to, or prepared to, commit a coup d'etat against Vladimir Putin.
Yeah,
Mr. Prigozhin.
I don't think at this point. I mean, everything is always wrapped in a level of mystery. But either he was shot down with a missile, or it was blown up, with a bomb on board or something. But yeah, I mean, everyone knew that Prigozhin was going to get killed. And then his plane blows up. And I thought it was a little funny. The New York Times had a headline, the effect of experts suspect that Putin killed Prigozhin or had ordered him killed. Oh, you think?
It's probably the least surprising thing that I could have read. As soon as they said he was feared dead, I was like, well, of course he's dead. And of course Putin did it. Now, the reason this matters is Putin is a very creative assassin. He's killed a lot of people in a lot of really James Bondy sort of ways, whether it be through poisoning or brazen, shots to the head, or in this case, shooting down a plane or something. It's not a surprise to anyone who's seen this Netflix documentary that eventually we are going to talk about the possibility that Putin and Russia were involved in MH370's disappearance, and the plane might have gone north instead of south. At the time, people thought that was crazy talk. In 2014, they were like, there's no way a world leader would go do something like this. But if you look at it, and if it, as current as it is right now, Putin's been behind a bunch of assassinations, some more obvious than others, and at least 2 of them, maybe 3, that have involved plane crashes.
Clearly, Putin is a guy who will shoot down civilian planes. 4.5 months after MH370 vanished, one of its 16 or so sister ships, a Malaysian Airlines 777, was shot down over Ukraine. At the time, it was almost universally believed to be a mistake, that some untrained militiamen had fired off a missile that they didn't really know how to use. It was later found, thanks to an online group called Bellingcat, that this was in fact carried out by a regular Russian army unit under the command of the GRU, which is Russian military intelligence. So,
check that one off. I mean, that's one that happened.
I mean, I wrote about this for New York Magazine. If people want to check that out, I'll put it in the show notes. But yeah, this kind of reinforces the idea that Putin is a really bad guy who doesn't have a lot of respect for the sanctity of civil aviation, and he will kill innocent people. I mean, Prigozhin, I don't think is an innocent person, but
no, the world's probably a better place without Prigozhin running around. But nonetheless, I mean, this was a very high profile assassination if it happened the way we thought it did. And it did, right? One way or the other, Putin's behind this. But this kind of stuff, is not unlikely or uncommon for him. I was just going through some of the other unusual assassinations, like Pavel Antov in December 2022, fell out of a hotel window in India, outside of Russia. So not only is this guy, giving people Russian window cancer, he's doing it outside the borders of the Russian Federation, which is a big deal. Here's another one, Dan Rappaport. He was a guy who he publicly condemned the Russia-Ukraine war, and he was discovered dead outside of his apartment building in Washington, D.C. Like, this guy is doing assassinations on foreign soil. So why would it be so hard for us to believe that he had something to do with MH370? For me, it makes perfect sense.
I think that, an important thing to recognize in this pattern is that sometimes they're very brutal and obvious, and sometimes they're subtle, and sometimes they're super subtle, like involving chemicals that were created specifically for this one assassination, and yet they still get found out. So, Putin is a KGB guy, and it's all about subterfuge, confusing your enemies, scaring people, creating a constant state of nervousness and uncertainty. And so being really confused is part of the game.
Right. So we are confused. The intelligence community is confused. That's kind of his intention here.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's probably a good place to pause this thing.
So that's where matters stood at the end of the first week. As far as we knew, the plane had gone dark, pulled a 180, flew up the Strait of Malacca, and disappeared again. What was going on? Why would a plane behave like this? Is there any chance that it could actually have landed somewhere and the 239 people aboard could still be alive? At this time, I was already going on CNN a lot, like multiple times a day, and people around the world were absolutely obsessed with the case. And I remember saying to some of the fellow guests on CNN as we waited in the green room to go on, I remember saying, like, can you believe it's been a whole week and we still don't know where this plane is? It seemed incredible. But then what happened next was even stranger, which we'll delve into in the next episode. Until then, thanks for joining me. If you like the podcast, please hit subscribe. If you want to know more, please visit our show page at findingmh370.com. For now, this is Jeff Wise saying, don't stop looking and don't stop asking hard questions. See you next time.